Hello, my name is Adam Gray, and welcome to Lesson 6.3, Reasoning Within the Text. The main focus of this lesson is going to be looking at CARS questions that move beyond basic reading comprehension and into reasoning, meaning taking what's in the text and making connections within it based on the relationships between ideas. The strategy is going to be an extension of our general strategy for CARS questions, and while we won't be drilling all 4 of these steps with every question that we see, we'll still be following the same order of problem solving, of looking at the question stem to identify question type, find out where the answer might be, and then move through researching, predicting, and answering, or eliminating as necessary. The specific learning goals here are going to be about the 2 question types that fall within this skill, those being inference and strengthen, weaken within the passage questions. Now, these 2 terms might seem new to you, but if so, then that's fine. The point of this lesson is to get you familiar with what these questions look like and how best to answer them. The way that we're going to do that is to focus on one passage. We'll first start with a sample of that passage, a couple paragraphs with 1 question of each type, and then expand to the full passage with some extra questions for you to practice with. To brief ourselves with the context of where this skill fits into things, remember that there are 3 main skills the MCAT outlines as things you need to perform on the CARS section to succeed. The first is Foundations of Comprehension, the second is Reasoning Within the Text, and the third is Reasoning Beyond the Text. And the one that's highlighted in this diagram is the one in the middle, Reasoning Within the Text, that has the 2 question types that we just mentioned when we saw those learning goals. These 3 skills will be tested in roughly equal proportion, 30%, 30%, and 40% respectively, meaning the 2 question types that we'll see in this lesson will be almost a third of the questions in this section. But perhaps more importantly, the sort of reasoning demanded of you on these question types, making strong inferences, and seeing the relationship between ideas in the passage will help you not only on these question types, but in other question types in this section, in the science sections of the exam, and in your life as a physician. If there's one thing you're going to have to do in school and beyond, it's do an awful lot of reading and make judgments based on it. So let's get started with that sample passage. We've got 2 paragraphs here that will be paired with 2 questions. So go ahead and take about 2 minutes to read these 2 paragraphs and make a label for each one. And don't work on the 2 questions here yet. Those we'll be walking through together, but read these 2 paragraphs and make labels for them now. Let's look at these 2 paragraphs, come together on good labels for them. The first paragraph of this passage starts with a strong statement about its topic. It says, if we should act to produce the best possible circumstances, meaning acting in our lives to make the best possible thing happen, then morality, which as we'll see is the largest overall topic for this whole passage, is extremely demanding. We then get the introduction and the explanation of this concept of the simple principle. The simple principle being what was mentioned in the first sentence. People should act as to produce the best possible circumstances. But it's clear from this first paragraph that the author is already pretty conflicted about this simple principle. The author says in the very first sentence that it means morality is extremely demanding. And in the rest of the paragraph, he expands on these implications with kind of negative language. He says it seems strange to punish these people by sentencing them to an impossible task. Those are very loaded words. It sounds like we're putting somebody in jail regarding morality. And so a good label for this paragraph as a whole is we get introduced to this idea of the simple principle, that we should act for the best. But the author says there are problems. We can't live up to this simple principle. Even though it's simple, it's really difficult. Then in paragraph 2, we get an expansion on this. From a certain perspective, an analytic perspective, these extreme demands are not actually a problem. That this theory of morality is just fine. It's not made invalid just because it asks for great sacrifices from people who follow it. And those first 2 sentences summarize the main thrust of this paragraph. But not to be ignored is the final sentence here, where the author introduces a major character of the passage, Liam Murphy, and his book, Demands of Morality. And the author even tells us where Mr. Murphy sits in relation to the simple principle. Because the author says that Mr. Murphy takes these objections seriously. And if by the time you got to the end of this paragraph you were wondering what objections those were, the answer to that is in the sentence before that. It means objections to the simple principle. So in other words, in these 2 paragraphs, the author introduces this simple principle. He says there are problems with it that some people don't mind, but this guy, Mr. Murphy, he takes these objections seriously. He thinks these objections are a real thing. So by the end of this paragraph, the author has put in opposition the simple principle, and people who defend it, and Mr. Murphy. We can summarize that with a label that's something like this. Some people think the simple principle, SP, is fine, but Murphy is the opposite of them. And then, just as due diligence, the end of this paragraph does say 2 distinct reasons, and just in case it becomes a major structural aspect of the passage moving forward, it's good to jot it down as your label as well. So now let's use just these 2 paragraphs to examine 2 questions that ask us to reason within the text. Here's the first one, and it's part of our first question type for this lesson, specifically inference questions. And what this inference question is asking us is, it gives us a passage reference, paragraph 1, and it says which of the following must be true. That is what an inference means on the MCAT. Something that if you read the passage and follow the logic in it, something that must be true. So it asks you to go back to the first paragraph, and for reference, here is the part of the first paragraph that's going to matter. It's the very end of it. The passage tells us if the standards of right contact are extreme, then they will preclude or make problems for personal projects that humans find most fulfilling. And this last sentence of the first paragraph supports the fact that choice B is the correct answer here. And the main takeaway from this question is why choice B is the right answer. Because both the passage and the correct answer form an if-then statement. One rule of logic that the MCAT is going to expect you to know, and this is also summarized in the Kaplan tip at the bottom of your page, is if A then B implies what's called the contrapositive of that statement. In other words, it implies if not B, then not A. So if I say to you, if I'm hungry, then I will go to lunch, then the MCAT expects you to understand that that means if I'm not going to lunch, then I must not be hungry. It's a swapping of the 2 terms and a negation of them. In the case of this question, the A is that moral standards are extreme, the B is that moral standards preclude personal projects, and if you substitute those statements for A and B respectively, the passage says, if A then B, in that last sentence of paragraph 1, and the answer choice says, if not B, if moral standards do not preclude these personal projects, then not A. They're not extreme. Based on this logical principle, it means choice B, even though it's not in the passage, must be true if everything else in the passage is true. And that is the heart of an inference question. Essentially, that inference questions ask you to make an inference. See what's in the passage and find something else that has to be true. So the right answer is not going to be stated directly in the passage like it would be with, say, a detail question, but instead will ask you to go just a little bit farther. And an important note here is not every inference question is going to expect you to understand these formal strictures of logic, if A, then B, and what have you. The reason why we use this question as an example of inference is because it follows that principle of must be true. There's a lot of inference questions that won't follow such a formal logical structure to find answers, but don't worry, we're going to see some of those as well when we get to the rest of this passage. For now, you need to understand that inference questions have an answer that must be true based on the passage. And that brings us to the second question type of reasoning within the text, or reasoning within the passage. And this question calls out its question type pretty early on because it is mentioning support for a certain idea, specifically which of the claims supports the simple principle, this idea introduced in paragraph 1. Now, if the question stem gives us something that straightforward, we're going to have to go to wherever the simple principle is mentioned and work back and forth between the passage and the answer choices to see which answer choice is mentioned as a piece of support for it. MCAT passages are all about evidence and conclusions, as you probably already know. And so we need to find out what the author mentions as evidence supporting the possible conclusion that the simple principle kind of works. And you don't have to go back and do that research yourself at this moment. You'll get a chance to practice these in just a few minutes, but the answer here is C. Let's look at why, though. It's because in paragraph 2, which is here on your screen, there is the second sentence, which mentions a theory. And in the context of the passage, a theory is specifically referring to the simple principle, because the simple principle was the only theory of morality so far that was mentioned in the passage, mentioned in paragraph 1. Then the second sentence says this theory of morality is just fine. it's no less valid just because it asks an awful lot from people who are following it. And of course, those exact words, asking great sacrifices, are exactly what choice C says as well. The fact that they are not less valid if they require great sacrifices. This is the example of what a strengthen and weaken within, or strengthen weaken within the passage question is going to ask you to do. They'll always be concerned with evidence that is either in support of or working against a certain argument. And for the ones we're seeing in this lesson, it's going to always be arguments that are already stated in the passage, and the evidence is also going to come from the passage. So the largest single skill these questions depend on is your ability to see both of those details and understand the connection between them, that one idea supports another one. Because that's how arguments are made, both in life and in passages on the MCAT. There's a conclusion the author will mention, and then evidence will be offered either in support or against it. And for this particular question, it focused on one sentence in the passage that connected the simple principle with a piece of supportive evidence. But enough of this abstraction now. Let's look at the full passage that comes out of these two paragraphs, and then a few more practice questions that you'll get to try yourself. Here on the next page of your book, you'll see the first two paragraphs. These are the same paragraphs we just saw a moment ago about Mr. Murphy, but then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 more paragraphs to show this full passage. You'll also be seeing over the next couple of pages 5 more practice questions that are all on reasoning within the text. We'll be seeing the rest of this lesson in 2 stages. First, read the entire passage and make your own outline in the space provided, and we will look through the passage together to make a full outline. Then, after we have a solid outline, you'll look through all the questions and answer them to yourself, and then we'll go over the answers to those. So let's start with that first task. Read the full passage to yourself, and this one has some pretty complicated language and pretty abstract ideas in it, so don't worry if it takes you a few minutes to finish. Try to get all the information you can out of it to make a good outline, but stop after you finish reading the passage and making your outline. Read the passage and make your outline now. So we already know more or less what the first 2 paragraphs of this outline should look like. The first paragraph introduced the simple principle and the fact that sometimes it has problems, and then the second one said, some people don't think those problems matter, but Mr. Murphy, in this book he wrote, he says the simple principle does have problems. So the author has established that Mr. Liam Murphy and the simple principle are kind of opposites in this world of moral philosophy. And whenever you see that kind of dichotomy being set up by an MCAT author, that is a relationship you want to follow throughout the rest of the passage. And we'll see that that relationship develops here as well. But now let's see where the rest of the passage goes, starting with paragraph 3. Paragraph 3 outlines the 2 reasons, first and second, that Mr. Murphy opposes the simple principle. The second one is where we really start hitting the meat of this paragraph and this passage as a whole. It says that Murphy recognizes the conflicts, the collisions between philosophy and our intuitive or natural sense of right and wrong. He says that we have these firm beliefs, in other words, the firm beliefs of what's right and wrong, the same intuitive sense that comes up in the previous sentence, and that from these firm beliefs, Murphy says that we create or forge moral principles. In other words, and this is a good label for this paragraph, Murphy says we go from these firm beliefs to moral principles. But, and this is a subtle point that the author makes, the simple principle, that idea from paragraph 1, does the opposite. The author sets up a contrast here in the last few words of this paragraph where he says what Murphy does not do. That Murphy does not say we should make beliefs given the principles that we have. So the end of this paragraph ends up as a reinforcement of the conflict between Murphy and the simple principle. And even though the words simple principle don't actually show up in the rest of this passage, it is referred to in ways like in the last sentence of this paragraph and through other terms in this passage as a contrast to what Murphy is all about. Then the author moves to paragraph 4, which is a pretty short one. It is, and if you identified this, your label probably says something similar, merely an example that supports paragraph 3. Paragraph 3 introduces this big idea that Murphy starts from beliefs, then moves to principles, so in a way the author feels like, well, I might as well spend another paragraph reinforcing this. In fact, he restates the last couple sentences of the 3rd paragraph here in the 1st sentence of the 4th paragraph, that he argues from our considered judgments. He doesn't call them beliefs, he calls them judgments, but in the context of this passage, those two mean the same thing rather than to them. Paragraph 5 then expands on the author's evaluation and explanation of what Murphy is trying to do in his book. So in a way, what this paragraph does is has more reinforcement of this you start with belief and then move on to principle stuff. There is, however, one new caveat that the author allows for, that Murphy understands this doesn't solve the whole problem, that we need to supplement these beliefs by reason when, for instance, my beliefs are different from yours, and so we come to different moral principles. This paragraph then closes with something else you might have noted in your outline, which is that we get an example of the Constitution. It's the way the author is saying, look, I know this has been a pretty abstract conversation so far. I'm going to ground it in an example. That Murphy is trying to interpret our convictions just like legal scholars interpret the Constitution. But even with that extra example and this extra explanation of Murphy, the author's main point is still in the basic same place. Murphy says we have these strong beliefs and we can make moral principles from those beliefs, even if sometimes we have to use reason to fill in the gaps. Paragraph 6 moves to a different place though, which says this approach, Murphy's approach, there are problems with it, disadvantages. Specifically, and we know these are the primary disadvantages because the author uses that great author keyword, primarily, the beginning of the next sentence. It can be hard for Murphy's arguments to motivate us, and that if we're basing morality off of what we believe, maybe different people have different beliefs. We're not all going to agree or converge on the same sorts of moral principles. And well, heck, some people, they have no morality at all, so they live outside Murphy's entire scheme. And so the author says, certain people, a moral skeptic, it's easy enough to point at Murphy and say, there are problems. Your approach has lots of disadvantages. And if paragraph 6 were the last paragraph of this passage, you might have walked away thinking the author didn't like Murphy very much, because he mentioned all these holes in Murphy's argument. But then comes paragraph 7, and it starts with 4 magic words, on the other hand, a huge contrast keyword. And just with those 4 words, you can already know that paragraph 7 is not about the disadvantages, but instead the advantages to Murphy. And the key here, the reason why we know it's the author's opinion this time, is because the author doesn't say, like he does in paragraph 6, that these other people, the moral skeptics, would say this. He just states it as true, that Murphy avoids lots of problems of other philosophy. And then this paragraph mentions all the nice things about Murphy, and all the ways he makes philosophy make sense. The final note that the author makes in this paragraph and in the passage as a whole is that Murphy, for all of his flaws, just kind of work in the real world a little bit more than first principle counterparts. And notice here, this is a stealth mention that the author makes of the simple principle. In the first paragraph, the author calls it the simple principle. In the last paragraph, he calls it first principle. But either way, the entire passage, first paragraph, last paragraph, and much of it in between, is this battle between Murphy and the first principle counterparts. Ultimately, the author's judgment is that both of them have their merits and flaws, but Murphy's does have some distinct advantages over the first principle counterparts because they are practical to everyday life. That gives us something like this as our outline. The first 2 paragraphs introduce the simple principle and Murphy. The third paragraph gives us Murphy's basic thesis that he goes from beliefs to moral principles rather than the opposite like simple principle folks do. Paragraphs 4 and 5 both support that basic thesis of Murphy, going into a few more details. Then paragraph 6 and paragraph 7 talk about disadvantages and advantages to Murphy. And we get the implication that the author thinks those advantages outweigh the disadvantages in certain cases. We know that because the author doesn't attribute the beliefs in that last paragraph to anyone else, and also because when you read a passage on the MCAT and you see 2 contrasting opinions, like those in paragraph 6 and 7 here, the second one the author mentions is almost always the one the author agrees with. It's a fantastic rule of thumb that will help you identify which of 2 contrasting opinions the author agrees with. The one that comes second, probably the author's opinion. Then finally, the reflect step before we move to the questions is to write down the author's goal. that what the author was doing here was reviewing Murphy's approach. Specifically, remember back in paragraph 2, Murphy wrote a book and the author's kind of reviewing the book, but then also contrasting that entire philosophy to simple principle or first principle philosophies. And as with all passage outlines, if yours doesn't look exactly like this, if it's a little shorter, a little longer, uses different shorthand, then there's nothing wrong with that. The important thing for you to take away, which you might have done when you read it yourself, or might have come together as we went through this over the last few minutes, is what Murphy's philosophy is, the fact that the author contrasts it with simple principle and first principle philosophers, and that we examine advantages and disadvantages of Murphy. If you've got those concepts down, you're ready to move to the questions and see more reasoning within the text questions in action. You'll see 5 questions over the next 2 pages, and you should do all of those to yourself right now. Again, some of them will require some reference to your outline, to the passage, so make that research, answer these as best you can, and also write down the question type, whether that is inference or strength and weaken. We'll then go through the answers, but more importantly, why those answers are correct, because those justifications for those answers are what's going to get you things right on test day. Go ahead and answer those 5 questions. Go all the way to the answer for all of them right now. So let's hit these one by one, starting with question 3. It says inferred right in the question stem. That is going to mean it's an inference question, but remember what inference questions mean. They mean it's going to depend on information from the passage, but it's going to require you to move a little bit beyond and find something that's an unstated fact that still must be true, even though the author doesn't say it outright. The best way to move through this question is to see the really strong reference that we have in the question stem. It's in quotation marks, doing philosophy from the inside out, and that matches up with the same quotation marks that you can see in paragraph 3 of the passage. The author identifies this inside-out philosophy as Murphy's attempt at philosophy. So even though the question tries to hide it a little bit, it's really saying which of the following can be inferred about Murphy's philosophy. And as we know from our analysis of the passage and our outline, Murphy is contrasted with simple principle folks. That may not be the only thing we know about Murphy. We know he argues from beliefs to principles, what the advantages and disadvantages of him are, and all of those can be considered as you evaluate these answer choices, but ultimately the correct answer is C, that it, again, Murphy's attempt at philosophy, is different from simple principle philosophy. There isn't any one sentence in this passage that says or paraphrases answer choice C, but based on the fact that the entire passage contrasts Murphy to simple principle philosophy, says that Murphy goes from beliefs to principles, first principles goes from principles to beliefs, they're exact opposites of each other. That is definitely fundamentally different, which is why C is correct. As for the wrong answer choices, A is incorrect because there's no information on whether Murphy was the first person to try to do this, completely outside the scope of the passage. Answer choice B is wrong because it says that Murphy allows no place for rational argument, but Murphy does allow place for rational argument. In fact, he says rational argument, in other words, using reason, is necessary in certain cases. That's said directly in paragraph 5. Answer choice D says it, again, it is Murphy in this case, is designed to dismiss objections. Dismissing objections would mean that you're getting rid of negative sentiment, meaning dismissing objections would mean you actually like something. So choice D, in other words, says Murphy likes the simple principle. That's the exact opposite of what the author says. The author says Murphy's the opposite of the simple principle. So what this question needed was not only the ability to synthesize information from lots of places in the passage in order to make a strong inference, but also, as is the case with all CARS questions, you can move more quickly through the answer choices as we don't fall for those trap answers like outside the scope choices and opposite choices like choice D. Let's move to question 4 now, and this one was another inference question. It calls it out right in the question stem. It doesn't say infer, but it says implies, and those two terms mean the same thing. They mean an unstated conclusion, something that must be true if you take the passage itself as evidence. And question 4 asks us to apply Murphy's philosophy to a certain group. The problem is, and what makes this question a little challenging, is that it doesn't give us a single place to go in the passage to answer it. like some of the other questions have. The entire passage is about Murphy's philosophy. And for that reason, if you saw this question on test day, you might want to nip it in the bud and say, I'm going to do this question later. I'll do it as the last question in this group of questions for this passage, which is a fine decision to make. In general, questions with strong passage references will be a little bit faster, a little bit easier to answer than ones without them. But once you do tackle this question, the best plan you want to make to answer it is say, well, let me refresh myself with what Murphy's philosophy is. And as we learn in paragraph 3, Murphy's philosophy is that we should go from our instinctive firm beliefs and to moral principles. That is, find those moral principles from those firm beliefs. And interestingly enough, the question stem even mentions one half of that relationship. The question stem says something about moral principles. So even though there's not a single place in the passage to look, your plan for going through the answer choices can be, well, it should have something to do with beliefs. Something to do with the fact that this moral principle would apply to a particular group if it comes from firm beliefs. And then you'll have to read through the answer choices, but the correct answer is D. If we're talking about two groups and they have the same fundamental beliefs, then if you follow Murphy's logic, same beliefs will become same moral principles. That's why D is correct. Another way to reach this answer, which you might have used or you could use for similar questions on test day, is highlighted by the Kaplan tip at the bottom of your screen. And it's a little tool called the denial test. In other words, for inference questions, if you take an answer and you negate it, you say the opposite is true. If negating that answer choice makes the entire passage fall apart, makes it seem like the author is contradicting themselves, just sets off alarm bells in your head, then that means that's probably correct. And in the case of question number 4, the author goes through the denial test for answer choice D in paragraph 6. In paragraph 6, the author says, if two groups have different beliefs, they'll probably end up with different principles. And that is a weakening of Mr. Murphy's argument. It's in paragraph 6. Paragraph 6 is where the disadvantages are. And so if all else fails, the denial test is a technique you can try to use to answer questions like this. Question number 5 comes next, and it's the first strength and weaken question in this group. You may have identified that by the fact that it actually says weakened in the question stem. And what this question asks for is, what is something the author mentions in the passage that weakens the author's argument? And if we've got a solid passage outline, we know exactly where to go. Paragraph 6 is the paragraph where the author specifically weakens Murphy's argument, mentions the things that are wrong with it, and it actually connects with that simulated denial test that the author went through in question 4. If you look at paragraph 6, the author says, hey, this morality of different people, it may not converge, and ding, 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 that's exactly what choice D says. And so if you know which paragraph plays the role of weakening Murphy's argument, you go to that paragraph and you find out which detail from the answer choices is in that paragraph, you've made it to the right answer. All of the wrong answers here, interestingly, are what we call faulty use of detail. Choices A and B and C, now they're all incorrect, but they do all mention details that are in the passage. This idea that Murphy doesn't tell people what firm beliefs to have, that's in paragraph 5. This notion here of punishing people who try to do good is in paragraph 1. And this whole from the inside out quote is from paragraph 3. So in a way, the MCAT with this question has presented kind of a puzzle. It's saying, hey, did you realize where the author was showing disadvantages and drawbacks to Murphy's approach? Because if so, and you can see where these details are, we'll reward you with the right answer. And that one here is D. So this was one example of strength and weaken within the text questions. And question 6 is another one, though it's a little bit harder to tell. Question 5 said weaken right there in the question stem. Question 6, though, doesn't show its true colors until you get to the answer choices. But once you do, it's very clear. The answer choices say support, bolster, challenge. All of these verbs are about strengthening or weakening an argument. And so the question stem here gives us a claim, specifically the claim that, hey, these moral philosophies, they don't have to give us the motivation to be ethical. And the nice thing about this, similar to the last question, is once you can identify this as a strength and weaken question, our outline helps us know where to go. Yes, the entire passage is about supporting or challenging Murphy or the simple principle theories, but for the most part, those arguments for and against Murphy are in paragraph 6 and paragraph 7. And it's a little hard to tease out, but if you look at paragraph 7, which is here at the bottom of your screen, one of the main arguments the author makes in favor of Murphy, that's what this whole paragraph does, it says good things about Murphy, is first that justifying these certain moral principles it's a hard thing to do. It's an extraordinary task. And this motivating force issue was actually something mentioned in paragraph 6 as a drawback to Murphy. The author said, one of the disadvantages to Murphy, one of the objections to Murphy's philosophy is that it doesn't grant a motivating force. But then, in the second and third sentences of paragraph 7, the author says, you know what? Granting this motivating force is really hard. It's an extraordinary task. And in the next sentence, the author says, all discussions of moral philosophy, they don't all have to give this motivating force. They don't all have to derive these kinds of justifications. So the author says, yeah, Murphy doesn't give us a motivating force. But you know what? Not everyone in the world has to give us a motivating force. And that statement, not every moral philosophy has to give us a motivating force, is the statement, the claim in the question stem. Remember, the question stem says, the claim that not all philosophies have to give us motivation. How does the author use that? Well, that claim is in paragraph 7, so it's something that is in favor of Murphy, and it not only is in paragraph 7, but it specifically references one of the things in paragraph 6 and says, yeah, this looked like a disadvantage, but it's not really. And that is what choice D says. It counters an objection. The objection is in paragraph 6. The countering of that objection is the role played by this claim in paragraph 7. Now, just a little bit of context before we move on. This is a high difficulty, a really challenging strength and weaken question. So if you got it wrong, don't really beat yourself up about it right now. The best thing to do with complex questions like this, if they are really bewildering to you, is to come back and revisit this in a couple days. You can do exactly that. It'll make a lot more sense and you'll be able to see it with fresh eyes. This is the same strategy you can use for challenging questions you see, all the way from now till test day. Let's move on to our last question then before we review and wrap up. This question is another inference question. It doesn't say imply or infer, but it does do something that a lot of inference questions will do, which is that this question says, hey, how would Murphy react to this conflict? It says, what does the author say about what Murphy would say? Or more accurately, because it's an inference question, what does the author suggest or imply? In terms of the MCAT, suggest, imply, infer, those three words mean the same thing. What does the author more or less say that Murphy would say about this little detail in quotation marks? And the first step towards answering this question, because it gives us a strong paragraph reference, is to know what paragraph that's from. This detail about personal projects that people find fulfilling, it's in paragraph 1. And the specific aspect of those that's given in paragraph 1 is that simple principle, first principle philosophies, they're kind of working against personal projects that humans find most fulfilling because they're so demanding ethically. So the author starts by saying this whole personal projects thing, simple principles work against them. But then in the rest of the passage, as we know full well by now, Murphy is in contrast to the simple principle. Murphy says, you don't have to listen to the simple principle. There are other ways to think about morality. And one of the things the author says in paragraph 7 is that Murphy's approach resolves a lot of the conflicts presented by first principle or simple principle philosophy. Conflicts like this one about personal projects. So in other words, because this question is saying, how would Murphy probably react to this conflict? Well, the only thing we know about Murphy, we don't know anything about his personal life or his history or anything like that. All we know about him from this passage is what his philosophy is. And the summary that we have for his philosophy is that he's all about coming from our basic beliefs. So after we've executed on that plan of following these details across our analysis and our knowledge of the passage, we actually can make a strong prediction for this, which is that Murphy would say, hey, you should follow my philosophy. That's going to resolve this conflict. And that is what choice C says. Choice C is just a paraphrase of Murphy's philosophy, that we should start with these moral intuitions, the intuitions of good and evil, right and wrong, that are mentioned throughout the passage as connections to Murphy's philosophy. Choice A is wrong because, as with way back in question 3, there's a double negative. Dismissing objections to the simple principle would mean Murphy likes it. Murphy doesn't like it. This is opposite to what Murphy believes, so it can't be right. Choice B is wrong because it's a faulty use of detail. Yeah, the Constitution gets mentioned, but it's just a subsidiary example. The Constitution is the author's example, not Murphy's example. And this question is saying, what would Murphy say about this, not what would the author say? And then choice D is wrong because, hey, maybe Murphy would be more practical. The author says in paragraph 7 that Murphy is more practical than first principle philosophy. But that, again, is something the author says, not something that Murphy says. The author says Murphy's really practical. Murphy doesn't say, I'm really practical. Murphy says, you should make your moral principles from your firm beliefs. And that's why choice C is right rather than D or anything else. But the takeaway here is extremely important because you will see questions on your MCAT that are like this one. Ones that say, hey, this character from the paragraph, what would they say about this? And because the only thing we know about characters in the passage is what they say in the passage, the MCAT directly asks you to make inferences based on what those people or what those groups of people did say in the passage. So let's review what you just saw in this lesson. We saw one passage about Mr. Murphy and his battle with the simple principle philosophers, but then we saw a bunch of questions. We saw some inference questions and we saw some strength and weaken questions. Inference questions are actually very similar to our good old friend detail questions that you might remember from Foundations of Comprehension. They're things that have to be true based on the passage, even though they're not quite stated in the passage. And strength and weaken questions are all about the relationship between two different details in the passage. Mostly, does one support the other or does one weaken the other? And those are the two main question types associated with this skill. If you've been watching these in order, then there's one more left, reasoning beyond the text, which will require similar thoughts to what you had to do here, but ask you to apply it to things that go beyond what was even started in the passage. But if you ever need to come back to this one and see some examples of inference and strength and weaken within the text questions, this lesson will always be here for you, and you can watch it again. Thanks a lot, and good luck.